Hey folks, we have a nice little treat here. It's myself, Billy, Hook Echo, and Stephen P. Shaw. For those who don't know, Hook Echo's real name is Scott, and we're just going to call him Scott because that's a lot easier than calling him Hook Echo this entire time. Um, Real quickly, let's start off. It is currently Thursday evening on January 12th, 2017, and um, what we're going to be doing is really talking about this latest big news that came out of the most recent issue of New Concepts in Global Tectonics. But first, um, quick update on some things that have been happening. The most recent big event was the 7-pointer that struck very deep down in the Philippines. And since then, things have been pretty interesting, haven't they been, Scott?
Yeah, it seems like the energy is spiderwebbing out instead of just transmigrating to one area. And then that might be good news in a way because a lot of these deeper earthquakes are lower magnitude. And actually, a lot of times, Choi and Casey, they use these deep, high magnitude earthquakes to apply the Blot long-term formula to these events. So, I mean, there's this short term that we've been using, then there's the medium to long term. And they got a pretty good formula down. I mean, they get the longitude, and they're usually within a month of their forecasts. I mean, a perfect example is they took the magnitude 6.3 in Russia that was 563 kilometers deep. And that happened back in, 2013?
Right.
And they reversed the long-term equation, and they matched it up with that Korea quake in October in 2016, and also with the Southwest Japan earthquake. It was a 6.2, like, what was it, 8 or 9 days later? And they're within a month, and they caught the longitude and everything. I think that's pretty amazing, if you
Well,
ask me.
absolutely. And could you imagine if we could just add that factor into what we're already doing? Um, that could be really helpful, um, especially in a time like now where it seems like just since that 7-pointer deep in the Philippines, we've had what we call blood echoes, those similar deep quakes that could be indicative of shallower ones to come. We've seen those northward towards Japan and even up into Russia. We've seen them south and even a bit southwest in Indonesia. We've seen them in Papua New Guinea, Fiji. Um, a couple of those areas may have already had their crustal release begin. New Zealand took one near the crust. Um, there have been a couple in Sumatra near the crust as well, which is a feasible migration point for some of the blood echoes. At least the one in like East Timor, that's somewhat feasible for that one. But boy, has this made forecasting really difficult because it almost looks like that energy went out in all directions, and where do you go from there? And as you said, maybe that's a good thing. Luckily, since then we haven't really had too much in terms of that large seismicity, and hopefully that stays off for a little while. But anyway, we're supposed to be talking about the latest from Dong Choi. Scott, do you want to introduce that topic a little bit?
Yep, just give me 1 second here.
Absolutely. Stephen, how are you doing while Scott is digging through what he's digging through?
Doing just fine, Ben.
Yeah, you're doing just fine?
Trying to deal with an early heavy snow event up here in northern Maine, but it is what it is.
It is what it is. Yeah, well, we're just lucky to get you on the call here because you're on a phone, and that's a new one for us on Skype. At least for me, I've never actually tried to get someone in on the phone there. This is really cool that this works. I've always marveled at how Skype lets us talk to people all the way across the world, basically instantaneously. Um, But the fact that it's not even just, restricted to Skype. Anyway, Scott, how's it
So,
coming?
all right. All right. Choi and Casey released this paper, this black paper, Great Deep Earthquakes and Solar Cycles.
What page is that on in the latest release?
582.
582. Okay, go on.
So, they have found a correlation or an anti-correlation with the solar cycle and the sunspot cycle. And there's a general trend with all the regions that on troughs and lows of the solar cycle, these deep great earthquakes pop up. Now, the Southwest Pacific really stands out. I mean, it correlates perfectly with the sunspot cycle. I mean, all the high activity periods represented by magnitude 6.5 clicks. I mean, they just correlate perfectly with the lows and troughs.
So the implication would be, of course, since it's John Casey on the paper, we know John Casey is one of the few folks at that, whether you want to say level or caliber of individual in the community, who is on board with the notion that the sun is showing signs that it's going to sleep. So that would sort of lead one to think that that would be a lower trough than normal, an extended trough, and what exactly that means for earthquakes might mean bigger earthquakes and more of them, right?
Especially high magnitude deep earthquakes, but we got to consider that Blot long-term formula applies to these earthquakes. So we're not necessarily going to see a short-term result of a higher magnitude from these deep ones. I mean, they have successfully forecasted out earthquakes like 3.5 years ahead of time using just these. So with everyone that's using this short-term blot forecasting, a lot of people are using it now. I mean, it works. But, I mean, we can't always expect a higher magnitude earthquake from these deep, larger earthquakes.
Well,
so that kind of,
I think that what we were just talking about to open this recording really illustrates the point that you were just trying to make, because rather than seeing the transmigration of that deep Philippines earthquake in one direction, I mean, I saw it go north, I saw it go slightly south, maybe even southwest, and I saw it go way, way east. That seems like it would be spreading out, and, if it's, I mean, the laws of conservation still apply here, and if that energy is being spread out, then maybe you wouldn't necessarily expect a larger magnitude event. I think that what we're seeing right now actually illustrates the point that you were just trying to make there. That it's tough to even really know what to expect. We're just sort of scratching the surface of what these deep earthquakes can really tell us about what's coming.
well, sometimes, I mean, Casey proposes this energy gets trapped. So Casey proposes that the Earth's core activity has entered an active phase since around 1990, right after the peak of that solar cycle. And as soon as it started coming down, the deep earthquakes started coming, especially in the Southwest Pacific.
I can't help but think that this would have, we should be thinking about, they're obviously thinking about this from more than just an earthquake perspective. They're thinking about this from a volcano perspective as well, right?
Right.
That's interesting. Well, how as observers, do we need to think about this practically? I know the first thing that's going through my head as you're sitting here talking to me about their mid to long range formula is, how do we coordinate so that down the line We know when these forecasts of theirs are coming so that, okay, that's great that they can forecast within a month, 3 years in advance. Wouldn't it be great if on top of that we could tell them which weekend was most risky, which week it was most at risk, when the signals were really strongest, and they needed to be on extra alert for the next 48 to 72 hours. So the first thing that's popping into my head is, how do we coordinate and cooperate so that um, these things don't slip through the cracks? And I'm not necessarily asking you. That's sort of just a rhetorical question. That's something that the observers are going to have to think about and work through. Um, but given the fact that we tend to focus a lot on the sun, and pretty much in every way you could think about it, the sun is showing signs that it's going to be entering another, at least extended minimum phase, like the Dalton minimum, if not the grand minimum. Cycle wise, timing wise, we are due for the bigger one. Um, it's really interesting because in the most recent deeper look that I put out, I believe it was January 11th. We're talking about how there have been a surge in earthquakes of 6.5 and higher just over the last 40 or 50 days or so, maybe even call it 60 days. A lot of folks have noticed it and have been talking about it. But we've also seen what can only be described as a coronal hole bonanza. The coronal holes have been constant. The northern hemisphere is essentially covered by coronal holes, half of it, and then part of that other half, the southern coronal hole extension reaches up transequatorially past the solar equator up into the northern hemisphere. This is not unprecedented, but when this happens, we do, of course, see fewer umbral and coronal magnetic fields looping from the surface to the surface, and much more prevalent interplanetary magnetic fields from those coronal holes. And what that means is less activity at the star, more activity distributed out to the planets. Just logically, based on what we know on space weather, that would be the kind of thing that would tell me that with a grand minimum, with extended periods of large coronal hole coverage, you should see more activity in the mantle of Earth. You should see, and consequently, whether it's over the short term or the mid or long term, correlating activity at the surface as well. Casey's probably.
And where do we see it? Sorry, where do we see the first signs of this? Is in the Fiji region. They got the mantle plume that rises directly from the outer core, and that's where we see the first signs. We start to see those deep earthquakes in Fiji. I mean, it responds directly with the sun and the interplanetary magnetic fields. And then we see that energy transfer a lot of times to the northwest. At least that's the way it seems been going now. And then moves.
It's either got to have a direct line to the west northwest at the transition zone down there, or there must be another plume under the Philippines as well. The way that the Earth spots just seem to make those quakes happen so well. I mean, did you see where that Earth spot was when that earthquake happened? I mean, it was basically right overhead. It's almost like that energy is constantly pluming up from there. We see a lot of deep activity, and perhaps it's maybe a little bit south of there in the Banda Sea, Molucca Sea, Java, East Timor region. But that would certainly include the Philippines as well. And it would almost seem like it wants to transmigrate either to Sumatra, northward towards Japan, or eastward towards Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, unless that Earth spot is there to really give it that pathway straight up. So that's interesting. Have you given any thought to, whether or not a lot of this transmigration is happening sort of in like a step-like fashion, across a layer and then up and then across, or if it's more of like a diagonal? I'll go first. I mean, I can tell you, I've thought of it more as, the current will go down these convective channels, and then hit one of these layers and then sort of ride laterally parallel with the crust. I can't picture it any other way. Something that's interesting. Looking historically, it is easy to see how Fiji is the focus, and of course, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, that general area. But we're definitely seeing this in the Philippines. I mean, we saw that deep quake all the way up in Kamchatka back in May of 2013, 8.3, 600 kilometers deep or something like that. We saw it in Argentina as well with that deep earthquake just a few weeks ago. Um, it really makes me wonder um, why there's not evidence of those types of events in the past as well. And it sort of leads me into two areas from there. One, did we just not catch that data? Do we just not have that data and it was represented in the past? Or the scarier option, which would be, are there now multiple places where this is happening? Are things shifting because Earth's magnetic field is changing so much and in the way that it is? Not just uh, in its strength in different positions, but the actual locations of the magnetic poles of the planet, which are no longer wanting to be on opposite sides of the planet near the north and south geographic poles, but are now racing towards a meeting place uh, near Java, Indonesia. Um, these are a lot of
Well,
interesting
it is
questions.
interesting to note, sorry, that there were no magnitude 7 deep earthquakes in the Southwest Pacific from like 1970 to 1984.
Yeah,
Then there was just like a small grouping, and then in 1991, when the sun's polar field started weakening and solar activity started to get a little unpredictable and declining, those are when the earthquakes started to pick up.
yeah, interesting. Well, I'm sure everyone who's interested in this should go read that. I know it's not hard to find John Casey's thoughts on what's coming, not just for the world, but specifically for the United States here in the coming years. Um, and a lot of it is based on what the sun is doing. And I have to say that um, he has a lot of deep earth and atmospheric ideas that um, maybe a bit above all of our pay grades in terms of physics, but the same reason why um, it's not sunspots but coronal holes that we see as the thing more likely to trigger earthquakes means that when we have a sun without sunspots for an extended period of time, we should probably see an uptick in those scary seismic and volcanic events, which is precisely what John Casey has been warning about for years now. And as we go ahead and enter sunspot minimum, some of these days it feels like we're practically there. Over on the incoming limb, there's actually a fairly sizable sunspot incoming right now behind the little one that we saw in the Thursday morning news, January 12th. But in general, that trend downward is at hand, and it'll be an interesting chance to see um, just how some of this is progressing, especially if we don't get a really strong solar maximum next cycle, and we just sort of continue downward towards the minimum. We might be able to get results a bit faster than we otherwise thought. While I have you guys here, you have any other thoughts you want to share with everyone? I'm sure that people are really happy to finally hear your voices, both Scott and you, Stephen.
Yeah, it was nice to finally come on. I mean, uh,
It's been a
here
long
we go.
time coming. I can understand. I know exactly what you mean. You've been, I mean, thousands of comments, hundreds of successful demonstrations of the blot echo earthquake forecasting. Um, just it's almost like an exhale moment, like, why has this taken so long? But anyway, folks, we don't want to take up too much of your time here. This has been a really fun 20 minutes or so. Of course, we keep our eyes on all of this, and Scott and Stephen, now that I know how to really wrangle you guys on here, and now that everyone else knows that I know how to wrangle you on here, I have a feeling you're going to pretty much be obliged to do this more often. And
Well, I have some more surprises to come too.
well, talk about leaving everyone hanging.
Hmm.
We can't wait to hear it, and it'll be fun. We'll see you guys later. Be safe, everyone.